The conclusions made in this video is, as far as I know, entirely unique and have never been explained this way before. So I really hope you'll find it enlightening. For many decades, Argentina's flag carrier, Aerolíneas Argentinas, owned a domestic subsidiary called Austral Aéreas. And during the 1990s, they operated a fleet of McDonnell Douglas DC-9s and MD-80 aircraft, used to connect cities of all sizes across the beautiful country of Argentina. One of those cities was Posadas, located in the far north of the country, near the border with Paraguay, which is where this story begins. In the evening of the 10th of October 1997, two pilots arrived at the airport in order to operate Flight 2553, a regularly scheduled service over to Buenos Aires using one of Austral's DC-9-32s. The captain was at the time 40 years old, with over 9,000 total hours, including many on the MD-80 series, but he was relatively new on the smaller DC-9, with just over 220 hours on that type. The first officer that he was scheduled to fly with was also 40 years old, with 2,900 total hours, and he was actually quite a bit more experienced on the DC-9 than the captain was, with 1,384 hours flown on it. The aircraft that was parked on the apron waiting for them was one of the oldest in Austral's fleet. It had more than 28 years under its wings since its manufacturing back in 1969, but it was still in a relatively good shape and was now being catered and loaded in preparation for the evening's flight. Sometime before 2100, the pilots walked out through the hot, humid evening and boarded the aircraft to begin preparing it for the flight over to Buenos Aires. And whilst the three cabin crew members started boarding the 69 passengers, the pilots continued looking through the dispatch paperwork, which included the tech log, weather forecasts and the flight plan. The route that they had been filed would, after takeoff, bring them towards the southwest on airway Upper Bravo 688 towards Monte Caseros, located at the triple point of Argentina, Brazil and Uruguay. And after that, they would fly via airway Upper Alpha 300 towards Gualeguaychú, before finally picking up airway Upper Whiskey 11 to Buenos Aires via waypoints Pagon and Vanar. Now, as you can see, this route was not quite as straight as it could be, and the reason for that was that it skirted the border between Argentina and Uruguay for most of the flight, and was designed not to leave Argentine-controlled airspace. But there was a NOTA, Notice to Airmen, issued for this route, advising that the VOR radio beacon at Gualeguaychú was out of service and had been so since the 5th of October. Now, as it turns out, the crew's dispatcher was unaware of this, so he hadn't noticed that the flight's computer-generated flight plan still called for the crew to use that unserviceable beacon. This NOTAM should have been obviously included in the pilot's dispatch paperwork, but the final report doesn't say whether it actually was or not. But really importantly for this story, that wasn't the only problem with the dispatch of this flight. Airline dispatchers are also supposed to provide flight crews with all available weather information for the route, destination and, of course, alternate airports. But in this case, that was also lacking somewhat. You see, the Posadas Airport Weather Office normally received printed forecast charts and satellite photos via fax, but dispatchers couldn't access the fax machine after a certain hour since it was located inside of a building that would be locked up for the night. So that meant that the pilots of Flight 2553 didn't get any visual weather maps, only written forecasts and coded METARs reporting the current weather at various airports. Now, Flight 2553's flight plan would take it through the Resistencia and Ezeiza flight information regions, but the area forecasts for those were not included either, since the dispatcher had never requested that information from Buenos Aires. Instead, the pilots were given only the METARs and forecasts for the destination and various alternate airports without any information on the weather for the en route portion of the flight. The dispatcher knew that there had been thunderstorms activity in that area during the day, but based on the METARs, he believes that this activity had passed to the east and that no more thunderstorms were expected. And we should remember here that the one ultimately responsible for preparing a flight is the captain, so he should have questioned this lack of weather info, but evidently he never did. And that was a shame, because in reality a new line of very powerful thunderstorms was at this point building over northern Argentina, moving in an easterly direction right across the planned route of Flight 2553. Satellite images confirmed an intense convective storm front moving east-northeast with cumulonimbus clouds, thunderstorms, reaching as high as 42,000 feet. But like I said, that information was never passed to the pilots. Anyway, after reviewing all of the paperwork that they did have and completing the pre-flight checks, the pilots soon taxied their DC-9 out to the runway and then executed a normal takeoff, becoming airborne at time 21:18 with the first officer as pilot flying and the captain as pilot monitoring. The expected flight time was only 1 hour and 16 minutes with a planned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet or flight level 350, so with only 69 out of 100 passenger seats occupied and the fuel tanks only partially filled for this relatively short flight, the climb performance was excellent and the pilots therefore reached flight level 350 after just 25 minutes. As planned, the aircraft then picked up the Upper Bravo 688 airway, heading southwest towards Monte Caseros, while the captain was in radio contact with the area control center in Resistencia. Now, quite early on, the controller asked them if they planned to deviate around any bad weather, to which the captain replied that he didn't think so. And that should have played as an indication that the controllers knew something that the pilots didn't. Anyway, just 3 minutes after reaching their cruise altitude, the pilots noticed what the controller was talking about, as their weather radar started painting some very large storm cells directly ahead of them. And in order to avoid those, the captain stated that they should probably pass it on the left, to which the first officer agreed and adjusted their heading left from 231 to 195 degrees, which also now started taking them away from their filed standard airway. Moments later, the captain also reported to the Resistencia controller that they were passing Monte Caseros at flight level 350, estimating Gualeguaychú at time 22:15. But he didn't mention that they had started to turn away from the route due to the weather. Now, since Monte Caseros was the boundary between the Resistencia and Ezeiza control regions, the controller instructed them to contact Ezeiza on frequency 125.6 or 124.5, which they also did. But Flight 2553 never actually entered the Ezeiza flight information region at all, because since they had started turning left, they had actually crossed the border into Uruguay instead at around that same time that it passed Monte Caseros, meaning that they were now actually flying inside the flight information region of ACC Montevideo. Now, these pilots didn't have a navigation display or GPS to clearly show their location as we have today, but they should have been able to see where they were and how much they were deviating using their VORs. The aircraft was also visible on radar at ACC Ezeiza, but the controller also didn't initially inform them that they had passed into Uruguay, for reasons that aren't really mentioned in the report. Generally speaking, we pilots obviously have to be 100% sure of where we are, especially around the country boundaries, since entering another country's airspace without clearance or confirmation can lead to fighter jets being launched to intercept us. So clear communication and coordination around weather deviations is really key, but in this case it just didn't happen. Instead, the pilots now spent their time chatting about various non-related topics, just passing their time as they normally would in cruise. After a while, the first officer mentioned that he would like to stay to the left of course instead of resuming the airway because of continued bad weather that they could see in that direction. And the pilots then also commented on the nearby clouds and how rapidly they were building and moving. Flying close to thunderstorms in darkness can often really highlight how active they are, as every lightning will illuminate the whole massive cloud, giving instantaneous snapshots of their big and intimidating nature. I've seen this myself many times as I've been operating throughout Europe and North Africa, but as long as you keep your distance, they are actually quite beautiful. A less beautiful part of traveling though is what happens when you get down on the ground and switch on your phone, only to realize that you now have to pay massive roaming fees to connect to the internet. In the past, that has led me to have to hunt around for local SIM cards, just to let my family know that I'm okay. And that's why I'm so happy to have partnered up with today's sponsor, Holafly, which is a trusted global eSIM provider. Now I really want to show you their newest product, HoloFly Plans, which is something truly revolutionary. HoloFly Plans is the first global eSIM subscription that gives you access to unlimited high-speed data in over 160 countries using one simple monthly plan. No more messy SIM swaps, no more relying on dodgy Wi-Fi, and no need to change your phone number every time that you're traveling. You can choose from the 25 GB or unlimited data plans, which both renew automatically. And this is super handy, since you'll never have to worry about running out of data or having to top up ever again. And best of all, you can cancel at any time. It's also really easy to set up. You just install the HoloFly eSIM, activate it, and then you'll have coverage wherever you go. And if you scan this QR code or go to sim.holofly.com/plans and use the code Mentour, you'll get a great 10% off on both the monthly and annual plans. Just make sure that you use code Mentour at checkout for your 10% off. Thank you HoloFly for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the story. In any case, at time 21:55, the captain made an announcement to the passengers, informing them that they were in clouds and could expect some very light turbulence, but also that it would be nothing to worry about. And almost immediately after he had finished, the master caution light suddenly illuminated, indicating some kind of system fault. This light and the associated oral warning on the DC-9 is intended to draw the pilot's attention to the warning panel, which then has dozens of different warning lights for all kinds of different systems. The pilots should use that panel to identify which system has triggered the master caution, but in this case they had some trouble reading it, since it was just flickering now and then. Most likely this was being triggered because of the transition of fuel from the center tank to the wing tanks, which would occur at around this point in the flight. And on the DC-9, the fuel in the center tank is usually much warmer than the fuel in the wing tanks, which can cause a sharp change in fuel pressure when the cold wing fuel suddenly enters the engines during the transfer from one tank to another. That in turn could result in an intermittent fuel pressure warning light coming on, which was normal but still triggered the master caution warning system and therefore had to be verified. During the process of checking this, the captain also noticed that the weather outside was now getting even worse, and at around this time, the cockpit voice recorder also began to capture the sound of static discharges outside of the cockpit, indicating that the plane was now likely flying quite close to a thunderstorm. The captain ironically joked about how he had told the passengers to expect very light turbulence, since the turbulence that they were now feeling was much worse and more significant than that. And the first officer just agreed to that and then started looking at their charts and weather radar in order to find some kind of solution to it. He soon said, "From here, if we go straight to Gualeguaychú, we'll enter Uruguayan territory." And that comment clearly showed that he didn't know exactly where they were, since they were already in Uruguayan airspace and actually had been for several minutes at this point. The two pilots then continued with a brief debate about where they were, presumably with reference to a chart, and the captain expressed his belief that they were already heading towards Gualeguaychú, which was not true. Now, this confusion might have been caused by the fact that Gualeguaychú VOR was out of service, remember from that NOTAM that I mentioned before, and that was likely combined with uncertainty over exactly how far to the left that they had deviated. Eventually, though, the first officer clarified that they were now heading towards a waypoint called Vanar, beyond Gualeguaychú, but the fact that they were also actually in Uruguay was never really discussed. Instead, after about a minute, the pilots went back to discussing the weather, which was now obviously their primary concern. The first officer noted that there was a strong wind coming off the thunderstorms and that he didn't want to go up against them, which was a very valid point. The captain agreed, but then steered the conversation back to that master caution light, and they then continued discussing whether it was possibly caused by the fuel tanks or not. After carrying out a few more checks and system tests, they still couldn't identify the issue, so the captain just joked, "Well, when something breaks, then we'll find out." Dark but classic pilot humor. At around that same time, the first officer stated that he was going to change heading back to the right a little bit after overhearing that another Austral Flight in their area had been told to contact ACC Montevideo. He then began a slight right turn to a heading of 216 degrees, but as he did so, the captain suddenly noticed that what had looked like a single storm was actually a full squall line, stretching south as far as he could see on the radar. Now, a squall line is a row of thunderstorms that can stretch for hundreds of miles, often caused by a strong cold front sliding in under a warm and humid air mass, forcing it upwards. And when these squall lines become bad enough, aircraft might not be able to cross them at all, and diversions becomes the only solution. Weather radars will often suffer from shadows forming behind major storms, blocking the view of more storms behind, and that's why it's sometimes hard to use the weather radar for planning weather avoidance in situations like this, and also why dispatch planning is so crucial. Now, the first officer agreed that the weather looked terrible, but the pilots then didn't take any further measures to prepare for a possible encounter with these storms. Instead, they just proceeded forward. And that was a problem, because the weather conditions ahead of them now contained several phenomena that were downright dangerous to an aircraft. We pilots are taught to always avoid thunderstorms by a wide margin, and that's due to the risk of things like lightning, extreme turbulence, damaging hail, severe icing, as well as powerful wind shears, many of which can extend several miles beyond the area of the visible cloud. On top of that, the powerful updrafts inside of thunderstorms can lift liquid water many kilometers up, where droplets eventually passes above the freezing level and become supercooled. Now, although those type of droplets initially remain in liquid form, they will then instantly freeze when they hit something that can kick off the crystallization process, like an aircraft, for example. This in turn causes really bad aerodynamic problems, as well as blocking sensors and messing with instrument readings. But normally, by the time that the water droplets reach the cruising altitudes of jet airliners like the DC-9, the outside temperature is so cold that no liquid water can exist. So for many years it was assumed that the icing risk was essentially zero if the total air temperature outside was below -40 degrees Celsius. But here I want to step in and add something that was only understood after this entire investigation was completed. You see, around 10 years ago, the aviation industry started to become aware of something that we now refer to as high-altitude ice crystals. These tiny crystals can be found at very high altitudes and at very cold temperatures, way below the range where ice is able to stick to an aircraft. They are dry, so they don't cause any aerodynamic effects, and they don't stick to the windscreen or the icing probes, which makes them very hard for pilots to detect. But they can still get into and clog various sensors, like the pitot tubes that measure our airspeed, and they can also clog the engine inlet pressure sensors, which can lead to erroneous engine thrust indications. The other really insidious thing about these crystals is that they can be blown miles downwind of our cumulonimbus clouds where they were formed, into airspace that we pilots might think is safe and free from any issues. Now, we pilots have long been taught to turn on the anti-icing systems when icing conditions are suspected. With icing conditions, we mean temperatures below +5 degrees and -40 degrees Celsius with visible moisture in the air. And for that reason, pilots might not have the anti-ice turned on when they encounter high-altitude ice crystals in clean air, with outside temperatures well below -40 degrees. One of the incidents that really brought this problem to our attention was the crash of Air Algerie Flight 5017 back in 2014. In that accident, an MD-80 encountered high-altitude ice crystals blowing out of a severe thunderstorm over Mali. And those in turn led to erroneously high engine thrust indications after the crystals blocked the inlet pressure sensors. Due to those indications, the pilots then didn't realize that the thrust was way too low to maintain their airspeed, and the plane decelerated until it eventually stalled. The pilots were unable to recover from the stall, and the airplane crashed into the Sahara Desert, killing everyone on board. Since that accident, this phenomenon has become widely known, but back in 1997, no one had really any idea that these high-altitude ice crystals posed any such danger to an aircraft, and that's worth keeping in mind. In any case, at this point, Flight 2553 was skirting the eastern edge of this Squall Line, where several severe thunderstorms were now billowing up to very high levels, well beyond the maximum altitude of their DC-9. During this time, the cockpit voice recorder also started capturing a notable increase in ambient noise levels, like some sort of precipitation hitting the aircraft. Bursts of static also shot across the windscreen as the plane sped through the highly charged air, prompting the captain to explain, "What's static from this puta madre?" And the first officer replied, "Look, look!" pointing out the eerie light of St. Elmo's fire on their windscreen, which painted the dark cockpit in a haunting shade of violet. The captain suggested that they should deviate further to the left and again joked about the turbulence levels, which were still much worse than what he had warned his passengers about. But what he hadn't noticed was that something else had now also started to happen. You see, slowly but surely, their airspeed indicators were now ticking lower and lower, from 275 knots down to 260 knots and then even lower than that, bleeding away speed at an alarming rate. And at this point, we need to dive into several really interesting details, because there are actually multiple theories about why this was happening, and depending on which one that you prefer, the next few minutes of this flight will look very different. You see, the main investigation into this event was led by Uruguay, whose experts wrote the official report. But because the aircraft was actually from Argentina, that country's experts also participated, and they came to rather different conclusions. The reason for this disagreement was largely because there wasn't much to work with. There was practically no physical evidence, and the flight data recorder was a very primitive model which only captured a few different parameters, one of which, the vertical acceleration, wasn't even working. So for the next part of this story, I'm going to start by telling you the official Uruguayan side of things, followed by the Argentine side. And after that, I'll share what my team and I have been able to dig up and what most likely happened. So get ready. The Uruguayan investigators believe that at this point, Flight 2553 started encountering severe icing conditions, leading to all of the aircraft's pitot tubes getting completely blocked. The pitot tubes are these little pistol-looking probes attached to the outside of the plane. They measure the impact pressure of the oncoming airflow, which is then compared to the ambient air pressure to determine the aircraft's airspeed. The DC-9 is equipped with 4 of these pitot tubes, 3 on the nose in front of the windscreen and 1 on the tail. The 3 forward pitot tubes supply the 3 sets of instruments on board, as well as the autopilot and various other systems, while the tail one provides airspeed data to the rudder travel limiting system and the flight data recorder. Now, if ice were to block these pitot tubes, a number of things can happen depending on whether the blockage is partial or total, or whether the inlet or the small drain hole in the tube freezes first. But for this story, what you need to know is that if the drain and inlet both completely freeze over, well, then a pocket of air gets trapped in between like a little time capsule, preserving the exact air pressure at the moment that it was sealed. In that condition, the airspeed will remain constant as long as the aircraft stays in level flight. But if the aircraft climbs or descends, the airspeed indicators will function like altimeters, meaning that they will read higher as you climb and lower as you descend. This is because a bigger difference between the pitot pressure and the ambient pressure means a higher airspeed, and the ambient pressure is inversely proportional to altitude. So if the pitot pressure is preserved as a snapshot, well, then increasing the ambient pressure would mean a smaller difference and a lower airspeed, and decreasing the ambient pressure will do the opposite. There have been several examples of this happening, like Bergen Air Flight 301, which I've previously covered on this channel. And this will also happen if you try to take off with the pitot covers still installed, which has unfortunately also happened many times. Now, Uruguayan investigators believe that the flight data recorder's pitot tube froze at around time 22:04 and 20 seconds, after which the indicated airspeed started to decrease as pressure slowly escaped from the nearly blocked pitot tube. They also believe that the other pitot tubes likely froze in a similar way at around that same time, since they were all subject to the same environmental conditions. Of course, pitot tubes have built-in heaters designed to prevent exactly this from happening, but the Uruguayan investigators believe that these heaters might not have been functioning, either because of an unidentified problem with the switch in the cockpit, or because the pilots simply forgot to turn them on during the pre-flight checks. Now, most aircraft in Austral's fleet were equipped with an amber warning light that would illuminate if the pitot heaters were not turned on, but this particular aircraft didn't have that because it was so old that it predated the requirement to have one. These warning lights had been required in the United States since 1978 and in Argentina since 1992, but the Argentinian authorities had given Austral an extension until 1998 to retrofit its oldest DC-9s, and at the time of this flight, that still hadn't happened. In any case, if this was the case, the crew were now in a situation where all of their airspeed indicators were reading too low, which can be a really difficult thing for pilots to diagnose and deal with. These days, we are rigorously trained to deal with unreliable airspeed events like this using clearly defined procedures who tell us to first stabilize the flight path using certain specific power and pitch settings, and those actions are also memory items, meaning actions that we have to do from memory when we identify the issue. Only once that's done can we then refer to tables of weights, altitudes and pitch and power settings to start cross-checking what our airspeed should be. That in turn will then allow us to determine which airspeed indicators, if any, are working correctly, and we can then go from there. But crucially here, this prioritizes putting the aircraft in a safe pitch and power state before starting to troubleshoot. Now, Austral Airlines operating manual did include a similar procedure, but unlike today, these pilots had never trained or practiced this type of emergency in a simulator, nor did they have any memory items associated with it. Now, as it turns out, the lack of unreliable airspeed training was far from the only training problem at Austral. The pilots of Flight 2553 also hadn't received any CRM, crew resource management training, that would help them organize cockpit tasks, freely share opinions and develop a shared mental model of the situation. Now, this training was already required in many countries back in 1997, but not yet in Argentina. On top of that, the pilots also had not been given any training on unusual attitude recovery, which drills into us how to respond correctly to any undesirable aircraft state, and what inputs that we need to use in order to stabilize the flight path. Without that training, pilots might be too slow to respond to a sudden upset, or they might panic and make inputs that just makes the situation worse. Now, one training that the pilots did receive was the approach to stall recovery maneuver. But even in that case, Austral's training was quite outdated. A stall occurs when the wing's angle of attack becomes so high that it stops being able to produce lift. And while that can happen at any airspeed, it typically occurs when the airspeed is allowed to fall too low. Austral's pilots had practiced stall prevention in the simulator, where the objective had been to prevent the stall from happening by increasing thrust and lift in response to a stick shaker. And the procedure that they were taught was to apply maximum thrust, adjust the pitch to minimize loss of altitude, then extend the slats to increase the lift if the plane was below the slat limit speed, and then finally to accelerate to a safe airspeed. Now, this was a quite common method taught to pilots around the world for many years, but by 1997 it was already seen as problematic. You see, this procedure assumes that the plane is at a low altitude, where it has a lot of excess thrust available to literally power out of an approaching stall without losing much altitude. But that procedure doesn't work when the plane is at a high altitude, since in cruise we're operating quite close to the performance limits of the airplane. Now, Austral apparently also had a separate procedure for stalls when performance is limited, without clearly explaining what that meant or when it should be applied. That procedure was totally different and called for the crew to pitch down to trade altitude for speed in order to improve the aircraft's energy state and then reduce the angle of attack. But Austral pilots never practiced these steps in the simulator, so they only knew of them theoretically. Which again wasn't that uncommon back in 1997. You see, at that time a lot of people thought of stalls as something that happened when the plane was allowed to decelerate too much on approach or after takeoff, not something that was likely to happen in cruise. Again, today we rigorously practice high-altitude stalls in the simulator thanks to a series of high-profile accidents like Air France Flight 447. But remember, those crashes hadn't yet happened at the time of this story. So the only stall training that these guys had gotten had taken place between 10,000 and 12,000 feet, and it had always involved extending the slats, which is worth remembering. Anyway, with all of this in mind, you can see that these pilots were wholly unprepared for what they were now about to face. Still unaware of their decaying airspeed, the captain now estimated that they must be nearing Gualeguaychú, where they were planned to begin their descent. So he instructed the first officer to start reducing speed in order to prepare for that descent. The first officer agreed, and he then commented again on the passing Squall Line outside of their windows. And now the captain suddenly noticed that the airspeed was already below the descent speed, so he told the first officer to give it a spark, dale un poco de chispa, meaning an increase in thrust. But the first officer replied that he had already done so. But as they now started a slow descent from 35,000 feet, the airspeed just kept falling. So the captain again repeated his command. This led to the first officer probably increasing the thrust too much, because the captain now suddenly said, okay, not so much. And he then added, lower it. In any case, we'll lose at least 1,000 feet. Now, we don't know for sure what he meant here, but he might have meant that they should increase speed by descending more. But in any case, the airspeed just kept falling, down through 245 knots, without seemingly responding to the first officer's efforts to increase it. Now, the Uruguayan investigators believed that this was because the airspeed indicators were acting like altimeters, causing the airspeed to decrease progressively as they descended. And that would then also mean that their real airspeed was in fact increasing, as it should when you enter a descent and an increasing thrust. But the pilots didn't recognize this. In response to this unusual situation, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and explained to the captain that he had done so to control the aircraft. The captain confirmed this and then added, "I'm going to put some anti-ice on you." And that must have meant that he now thought that they were in some type of icing conditions. Now, this might have been unrelated to the difficulties with the airspeed, or he might have thought that drag from accumulated ice on the wings could be the cause of the decreasing speed. We don't really know. In any case, the first officer replied with an ambivalent statement, which the captain then interrupted by saying, "Watch the speed!" because it was still decreasing. He then added that the first officer should continue descending, but the first officer just replied that he already was. So Flight 2553 had now left Flight Level 350 without first requesting permission from air traffic control, and when the captain realized that, he really quickly hopped onto the radio to request descent from ACC, Ezeiza. But the flight wasn't in Ezeiza's sector, so the controller just replied, "Sir, you are in the territory of Uruguay." At this same time, the airspeed had now fallen to 224 knots and was still reducing, so the captain snapped, "Pay attention! Lower the nose!" And the first officer replied that he already was descending with 4,000 feet per minute, and yet this didn't seem to be helping at all. Maybe because the pitot tubes were still blocked, and the indicated airspeed was still erroneous. Not having heard Ezeiza's control's reply to his first message, the captain again asked for descent, but was just told to contact Montevideo on 128.5. By this point, the real airspeed was now increasing so much that the sound of rushing wind was getting louder and louder on the cockpit voice recording. And it was at this moment that the captain appeared to realize that their indicated airspeed wasn't correlating with their flight path at all, so he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh no, reduce the speed! My speedometer is jammed! Don't go any lower!" But the first officer didn't seem to have heard this call, because he now asked the captain for the slats to be extended. That could only mean that he thought that the airplane was now flying so slowly that it was in danger of stalling. And in order to keep that from happening, he was now applying the only approach to stall procedure that he had practiced in the simulator. But remember, extending the slats wasn't part of the procedure for avoiding a stall at high altitude, and that was for a very good reason. For one, the speed of the aircraft at cruising altitude is normally well above the limit speed for the slats. Below 15,450 feet, the DC-9 slats are not allowed to be extended if the airspeed is above 280 knots due to the risk of structural damage. And above that altitude, the limit is Mach 0.57, which is the speed expressed as a percentage of the local speed of sound. Subsonic airliners aren't designed to get close to the speed of sound because of some very unpleasant aerodynamic effects that can start to occur there. But that mainly becomes an issue at higher altitudes, since the speed of sound decreases with the lower temperatures there. This also means that the dangerous aerodynamic Mach effects becomes the primary risk associated with extending the slats at high altitudes, which was why the limit speed was set as Mach 0.57 and not an airspeed value in knots. Now at this point, the indicated airspeed recorded by the flight data recorder was only about 220 knots, and investigators believed, based on the pilots' conversations, that they were seeing similarly low values. But at the altitude they were still at, of around 33,000 feet, their Mach number was still at Mach 0.63, which was therefore above the slat limit speed. And by the way, Uruguayan investigators believed that their real airspeed at this point was probably around 320 knots, or Mach 0.84, which in that case was way above the slat's structural limit as well. Now, since there isn't any procedure on the DC-9 that calls for using the slats above 15,000 feet, the pilots wouldn't have had much practice referring to Mach numbers as a limiting factor for slat extension. And even if the first officer had, he wouldn't have been able to tell what Mach number that they had due to the design of the DC-9's combined airspeed and Mach indicator. This instrument uses a single needle to display airspeed on a fixed dial, while Mach number was displayed on a rotating inset dial, so that the current Mach number could be aligned with the needle position. And the inset dial was positioned next to the upper portion of the airspeed scale and was activated at 250 knots. So below that airspeed, the Mach number couldn't even be seen. This meant that Flight 2553 was now in an edge scenario, where the indicated airspeed was below 250 knots, so no Mach number was displayed, but the Mach number flown was still above the slat limit of Mach 0.57. Because of this, the first officer might have believed that it was safe to extend the slats in an attempt to increase the lift to avert a stall, and by now a breakdown in communication and CRM was also taking place in this cockpit. You see, the captain likely didn't hear that his first officer was requesting slats because he was still focused on trying to contact Ezeiza for that descent clearance. And he was obviously having trouble hearing Ezeiza's transmissions because they weren't even in that sector, meaning that the radio connection was very weak. So he hadn't understood that they needed to contact Montevideo for the clearance. At this point, his priorities should have been to aviate, navigate and communicate in that order. And since his first officer was having trouble flying the plane, he should have focused on helping him and asking for descent clearance later. But that kind of prioritization would have required dedicated CRM training, which they hadn't received. As a result, he just kept asking, "For what level, Ezeiza? Can you repeat my level?" Which then again prevented him from hearing the first officer asking, "Put slats for me, immediately!" Over the radio, the controller now repeated the message from previously to contact Montevideo on 128.5, to which the captain just desperately replied, "Please authorize me to descend, now!" And at that exact moment, the first officer likely ran out of patience and just reached over to extend the slats himself. A decision that would prove catastrophic. As soon as the slats were extended, the airplane was suddenly rocked by terrifying sounds and vibrations, followed by the first officer instantly losing both yaw and pitch control. The plane then entered a series of wild gyrations before eventually pitching over and entering into a spiral dive, spinning like a top about its lengthwise axis. Uruguayan investigators believe that at the speed that they most likely were traveling, the aerodynamic forces had been so great that some of the slats were ripped straight off the plane when they were extended, causing an immediate loss of control due to catastrophic wing damage. Seconds into this terrifying scenario, the airspeed recorded by the flight data recorder then suddenly shot up from around 215 knots to 450 knots in just 3 seconds, before eventually maxing out at a terrifying 474 knots, which was the most that the flight data recorder could measure. McDonnell Douglas later found that an actual acceleration like that was physically impossible, because even in a dive with full power, the airplane couldn't do that. So the Uruguayan investigators believed that this spike was caused by the ice that had blocked the pitot tubes suddenly dislodging, revealing the aircraft's true speed. But right at this point, as the DC-9 is now suddenly plunging from 30,000 feet, I want to pause and roll back the clock about 5 minutes or so earlier, before any of this had really happened. Because, like I mentioned, what I just described to you isn't the only version of events, and to really understand this accident, we also have to hear the other side of the story. During the investigation, the Argentine investigators conducted a number of experiments and studies that led them to conclude that the ice blockage theory wasn't actually what really happened. Instead, they argued that there was never any pitot tube icing at all, and that the recorded airspeed was in fact correct, all the way up until the point that the slats were extended. Argentina pointed out in its own report that the probability of all 3 pitot tubes freezing over in exactly the same way at exactly the same time is virtually nil, since ice accumulation in itself is very random. On top of that, the design of the pitot tube in the tail was different from the other 3 tubes, making it even harder to extrapolate what the other pitot tubes were doing. Instead, they argued that the reason why the pilots discussed having a low airspeed was because the airspeed was in fact low. Argentina cited a study that they had carried out showing that with the aircraft cruising at its service ceiling of 35,000 feet in turbulent conditions, the thrust settings most likely used by the crew could have led to an airspeed decay due to the airplane ending up behind the so-called power curve. The power curve is a mathematical equation depicting the amount of engine thrust required to maintain a particular airspeed at a given altitude, and this equation forms a parabola with higher speeds requiring more power, a sweet spot in the middle, and then low speed again requiring more power to maintain. The reason that you need more power to maintain a lower speed is because maintaining lift at a lower speed requires a higher angle of attack, which then causes more drag. If more thrust is not applied, well, then the airplane will lose even more speed, resulting in an even higher angle of attack needed, causing more drag, and so on. So, if the autopilot is in altitude hold mode, as it normally is in cruise, well then it would just keep raising the nose to increase the angle of attack, making the situation worse and worse. This means that if the pilots let the speed drop low enough before intervening, well then the thrust required to stop that airspeed decay could be greater than the thrust available, in which case the only option would be to increase speed by descending to a lower altitude, basically converting potential energy into kinetic energy. The Argentine report argues that this was exactly what happened here. In fact, the airspeed recorded from the flight data recorder shows that the speed decreased almost linearly for several minutes before the pilots started their descent from 35,000 feet. And this decay then worsened when the captain turned on the anti-ice. The anti-ice system for most jets like the DC-9 uses hot bleed air from the engines to melt the ice, which also reduces engine power. So because of this, the maximum service ceiling of the DC-9 is 33,000 feet with engine anti-ice on, and only 32,000 feet if both wing and engine anti-ice is used at the same time. But in this case, the captain turned on the anti-ice while the plane was still at almost 35,000 feet, which could therefore have left the engines without enough thrust to maintain that altitude. The captain also told the first officer to start the descent by first decreasing speed, which would have made the situation even worse. Now, the reason that the airspeed then didn't increase during the descent was a combination of insufficient engine thrust and a continued high angle of attack, which might have caused so much extra drag that it cancelled out the extra kinetic energy provided by the descent. And that high angle of attack during the descent could also explain why the captain told the first officer to lower the nose. And it could also explain why the airspeed didn't increase much when the first officer increased thrust, as they were so far back on the power curve that the thrust required to stabilize the flight was greater than the thrust available. But the interesting thing here is that the speed actually did increase a little bit for a short while during that descent, not enough to change things, but enough to show up in the data. And that just wouldn't have happened if the pitot tubes were fully frozen over, because if that was the case, the airspeed should have just continuously decreased as they descended. All of this means that the first officer, who was more experienced on the DC-9 than the captain, probably correctly predicted that they were going to stall if this situation continued. But the captain didn't recognize this and didn't understand how they could have such low airspeed while they were in a 4,000 feet per minute descent, so he just thought that his airspeed indicator must be wrong. Then, instead of trying to troubleshoot, he then became preoccupied with trying to obtain a descent clearance, leaving the first officer to handle this situation alone. And whilst believing that the airplane was approaching a stall, he then applied the only approach to stall recovery procedure that he knew, which involved extending the slats. At that moment, they were descending out of flight level 310 at a speed of about 220 knots, or Mach 0.63, and the Argentine report pointed out that this would not have been fast enough to rip the slats off the plane. The slat limit of Mach 0.57 is an aerodynamic limit only, while 280 knots is the structural limit, so since they were below the indicated airspeed limit but above the Mach limit, the slats therefore didn't rip out when the first officer extended them. But studies conducted by the Argentine investigators showed that extending the slats between Mach 0.57 and Mach 0.66 would cause a significant pitch down moment, an increase in drag and a decrease in lift, causing the plane to quickly enter a rapid descent. The pilots would have therefore experienced a sudden, horrific gyration and negative G-forces as the plane shuddered and then fell out of the sky, dropping and yawing violently as it tipped over into a spiral descent. Argentine investigators then gathered data from a similar maneuver flown in a fighter jet, and that showed that the spinning motion of the aircraft in the spiral dive would have caused the airflow to hit the pitot tubes obliquely, resulting in erroneously low airspeed values during the corkscrew. And when the plane then stopped spinning and airflow resumed, the recorded speed shot up to 450 knots and beyond, which would indeed have been the real speed of the aircraft as it was accelerated into a nosedive. So stopping here again, one of the really interesting things about this theory is how closely it resembles the crash of West Caribbean Airways Flight 708. This was a high-altitude stall in an MD-80 that happened back in 2005, and one that I've also covered on this channel. In that accident, the pilots flew too high with the anti-ice engaged, resulting in a loss of speed and the flight ending up behind the power curve. Eventually, the pilots tried to descend, but the angle of attack remained too high and they continued to lose speed until the aircraft stalled. And what's remarkable here is that the Argentine investigators didn't know about that crash since it obviously hadn't happened yet, so they basically predicted almost all of the actions and parameters in that accident. Now, the Argentine report doesn't clearly explain how Flight 2553 ended up behind the power curve in the first place, given that it shouldn't have been too hard to maintain 35,000 feet in a pretty lightly loaded aircraft. And it also argues that Flight 2553 couldn't have been in icing conditions because the chances of icing at such a high altitude with temperatures below minus 40 degrees Celsius were thought to be virtually nil. But since the captain decided to turn on engine anti-ice, and because the sound of precipitation could be heard hitting the aircraft, I think icing conditions probably did still exist, but not in the form that they thought. And that's where I want to bring in all of the stuff that I said earlier about high-altitude ice crystals, which none of the involved authorities even knew about when this report was written. In fact, my team and I think that high-altitude ice crystals could fill in a lot of the missing pieces in this story. You see, Flight 2553 was flying downwind of severe thunderstorms at high altitude and in very cold temperatures, which is precisely where we expect to find these type of crystals. And if those crystals started hitting the aircraft, they would explain the noise heard on the cockpit voice recorder and the captain's belief that they were in icing conditions. If those crystals then started blocking the engine inlet pressure sensors, like what happened to the Air Algérie MD-80 in 2014, well then that could also explain why the flight started losing speed at around the same time as those conditions were entered. Basically, blocking those sensors tricks the engine instruments and autothrottle into believing that the engine is producing more thrust than it actually is, which also causes the pilots and autothrottle to believe that they have an appropriate thrust setting when actually the thrust is too low. With everything that was going on in this cockpit, from handling the weather conditions to the master caution and the ATC communications, the pilots might then not have noticed that the airspeed was decreasing for several minutes. And it could also then have tricked the first officer into believing that he was applying high enough thrust when he actually wasn't. Now you might be thinking, if they were in high altitude ice crystals, couldn't those have blocked the pitot tubes too? After all, isn't that what happened to Air France 447? But even though that is a good point, I think that it's really unlikely, because in cases like Air France Flight 447, where ice crystals did cause a loss of reliable airspeed indications, those indications didn't look anything like the ones that we see here on Flight 2553. In those more recent incidents, the loss of airspeed was asymmetrical, intermittent and partial. It wasn't continuous, total and smooth like on Flight 2553. In fact, the airspeed data from Flight 2553 most closely resembles behind the power curve accidents like West Caribbean and Air Algeria, not unreliable airspeed accidents like Air France 447. Also, the pitot tube icing theory relies on a lot of improbable assumptions, like that the pitot heat somehow was not working or wasn't turned on, and that all three pitot tubes then got completely blocked at almost exactly the same time. As the Argentine report points out, there isn't direct evidence for either of those things. Instead, the pitot icing theory is based on that sudden spike in airspeed during the dive and the captain's comment that his speedometer was jammed. Everything else was assumed by working backwards from those two data points. Now don't get me wrong, the Uruguayan theory is technically possible. It is not a total fantasy, but when we laid everything out like I'm doing for you now, with all of the modern knowledge that we have today, my team and I came to believe that Argentina's explanation for the events is probably closer to the truth of what really happened, combined with our new addition of high-altitude ice crystals. And with that in mind, let's get back to what ultimately happened to the flight. As the plane went into this violent and terrifying spiral, the pilots could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder shouting things like come out, and "Oh my God!" The recording also captured a cacophony of noises like crashing objects and howling wind, as well as a spurious landing gear alarm. In the background, the Ezeiza controller repeatedly tried to authorize them to descend, having coordinated this with Montevideo, but no reply ever came. And the controllers in Montevideo now also had to scramble to get nearby aircraft out of the way as Flight 2553 plunged uncontrollably through their airspace. Unfortunately, with the severe aerodynamic effects of the deployed slats combined with the stomach-churning aircraft movements, lack of visual references and lack of upset recovery training, the pilots had almost no chance of recovering from this terrifying dive. Instead, the plane just kept accelerating downwards, almost vertically, soon reaching an unimaginable descent rate of 34,000 feet per minute. The speed surpassed Mach 0.9 and then approached the speed of sound, while the cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of the aircraft vibrating as it threatened to tear itself apart. The very last sound on the cockpit recording was the captain calling for the flaps down, and the voice of an unidentified pilot on the radio saying, "553, Ezeiza is calling you, just come down." Moments later, the recording ended as Flight 2553 slammed into the Uruguayan countryside, nose first and in an almost fully inverted position. The impact forces were biblical, almost beyond description. The DC-9 carved out a 6-meter deep airplane-shaped crater in the dirt, spewing debris for hundreds of meters and driving tiny shattered pieces deep underground. Obviously, it was a completely unsurvivable impact. As soon as the plane disappeared from radar, controllers in Montevideo alerted local rescue services, and just a few minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning, searchers found a detached slat near the Rio Negro, east of the town of Nuevo Berlin. This slat likely detached due to the extreme speeds during the final part of the dive, since the impact crater was later found just 2,000 meters away. When the rescue team got there, the destruction was so complete that not only were there no survivors, they couldn't identify a single body, even with DNA. So the only way to know that 74 passengers and crew had perished was by the contents of the flight's manifest. In the end, this crash became quite infamous in Argentina, spawning documentaries and court cases lasting years and even decades after the accident. But until now, most accounts of the story have been based on the Uruguayan findings, without taking the Argentine findings or modern accident knowledge into account. And yet, while there are significant differences between the two theories, a lot of the lessons are actually the same. This crash was made possible by a sweeping lack of training, from CRM to unreliable airspeed to high altitude stalls to upset recovery to threat and error management, which left these pilots woefully unprepared for what they encountered that night over Uruguay. Many of the lessons were then learned and incorporated into modern pilot training only later, after accidents in the 2000s and the 2010s, making this accident something of an overlooked precursor. These days, we pilots are taught how to avoid and recover from stalls at any altitude using less confusing procedures, and we're also taught how to identify and deal with unreliable airspeed. On top of that, most aircraft, including the Boeing 737 that I fly, have maximum altitudes for flaps and slats extensions, and we also have better weather forecasts, better knowledge of weather phenomena, and so on. Now, I am so proud of my team for this episode. It took a lot of research to uncover the full extent of these opposing theories and then incorporating my experience into the mix. And that was only possible because of my sponsors and especially because of my patrons that are allowing me to pay my team for their time and dedication. So if you would want to support what we do and keep getting these deep diving documentaries, well then please consider joining my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot to support. Thank you so much for watching and check out these videos next. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.